Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story 1. I've always been drawn to the quiet of nature. There's something about being alone in the woods, surrounded by towering trees and the stillness that settles over everything, that brings a sense of peace. That's why I decided to go camping alone last weekend, far off the beaten path where nobody could bother me. I wanted solitude, just me, the forest, and the stars. But, like most things, this trip didn't turn out the way I expected. It started out fine enough. I set up camp beside a small clearing with pines all around me. The wind rustled the needles, and for a moment, I could almost believe the world outside of the forest didn't exist. I pulled out my thermos of coffee and settled back against the rough bark of a tree, just breathing in the cool, pine-scented air. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest seemed to change. It wasn't sudden, more like a shift, subtle but undeniable. I could feel it in the air, like the trees were somehow alive, aware of my presence. I tried to shrug it off, but a gnawing unease began to settle in my stomach. That's when I heard it, a whisper. It was soft, barely audible above the howling wind, but unmistakable. It came from somewhere within the pines, from the shadows just beyond the campfire's reach. I froze, straining to hear. The sound came again, clearer this time. It was words? No, not words, more like soft, hurried syllables. They were indecipherable, lost in the rush of the wind. At first, I chalked it up to my imagination. It wasn't anything new. I had heard trees creaking and groaning before. But the more I listened, the more I realized these sounds weren't natural. There was intent behind them, a rhythm. Someone or something was whispering, and the voices seemed to be getting closer. I grabbed my flashlight and turned it on, the beam cutting through the dark, but the shadows seemed to scatter, never revealing anything. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. Maybe it was just the wind playing tricks. Maybe I was just spooked by being alone in the dark. But then the voices came again. This time, they were clearer, closer. I could hear them moving, shifting between the trees, circling my camp. Come closer, come closer. The words rolled out like a chant. I gripped my flashlight tighter, the beam trembling with my hand. There was something about the voices, something familiar yet foreign, as though they were trying to tell me something important, something I couldn't understand. I stood up, turning in slow circles, my eyes darting into the darkness. My heart thudded in my chest, each beat louder than the last. The wind howled, branches creaked, and the whispers swirled around me like a storm. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I stepped closer to the fire, the warmth of the flames giving me a false sense of security. The shadows never stopped moving. I tried to ignore the fear creeping up my spine, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks. But then, in the midst of the rustling, I thought I saw something, a figure, moving just outside the reach of the firelight. A silhouette, tall and thin, with long, spindly limbs. I blinked, and it was gone. I wasn't imagining it. The whispers continued, filling my ears like a constant hum. "You're not alone," they whispered. "Not alone in the woods." I grabbed my bag, yanked out my tent, and scrambled to set it up. I needed the shelter, needed to feel like I was safe, though deep down I knew nothing could protect me from whatever was out there. As the hours dragged on, the voices grew more intense. The wind howled and screamed through the pines, but the whispers never ceased. They taunted me, beckoning me closer, pushing me to listen to their secrets, to understand what they were trying to say. I woke up the next morning in a cold sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. It was still dark outside, and the air felt wrong, heavy like something was watching. I rubbed my eyes, confused. It didn't take long for the shock to set in. My tent was moved, not just shifted a little like a gust of wind had pushed it. It had been relocated. The poles were bent, the stakes were twisted, and there, just outside the entrance, was a small pile of leaves. Fresh leaves, not the ones that had fallen in the last few days. I stood, my legs weak beneath me, and looked around. The campfire had burned out, the cold ashes smoldering in the gray light. There was no sign of anyone, no sign of anything that could have caused the tent to move like it had. But the whispering, it was still there. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. "Leave. Leave the pines. They belong to us." I didn't wait another minute. I packed my things as fast as I could, never taking my eyes off the shadows. I was out of there before the sun fully rose, heading back to the car with a sense of dread gnawing at me the entire way. I haven't been back to those woods since, and I don't plan on it. Whatever it was in the pines, it's still out there, waiting for someone else to listen to its whispers. And I wonder, what would have happened if I had listened? Story 2. It was supposed to be a simple trip. Just me and Jason. Two brothers getting away for the weekend, away from all the noise of the city, into the quiet of the woods. We'd done it before, camping by the stream, under the canopy of towering trees. It was a tradition of ours, and it had always been something we could count on to unwind, reconnect. We arrived early, set up camp by the water, the rush of the stream a constant companion in the background. The smell of pine filled the air, earthy and fresh. It was perfect. I could feel the tension in my shoulders start to slip away as we worked together, getting the fire going, laying out the sleeping bags. The sun dipped low, painting the sky with colors you could never replicate in the city. Everything felt right until it didn't. By the time the fire was crackling, the shadows had grown long. Jason had wandered off. Nothing unusual there. He had a tendency to roam when we were out in the woods. He loved the isolation. But as the darkness deepened, I noticed he hadn't come back. At first, I thought maybe he was just lost in his thoughts, enjoying the solitude a little too much. But when the minutes turned into an hour, I began to wonder. I stood up, brushing dirt off my pants. "Jason," I called, my voice breaking the stillness of the night. My flashlight swept through the trees, catching on the uneven bark, the twisting branches that reached for the sky like hands begging for something. Nothing, not a sound, not even the usual rustling of small animals moving in the underbrush. "Jason," I shouted louder this time, my voice rising with a knot of worry in my throat. The night seemed to swallow my words whole. I checked the area around our camp. Nothing, no sign of him. I traced his steps back along the edge of the stream, calling again, but all I got in return was the rushing sound of water, the croak of distant frogs, and the eerie whisper of the wind through the trees. My heart began to race. I could feel the air growing colder, denser, like the forest was pressing in around me, suffocating the space between each breath. Then I saw it, Jason's backpack, his red and black pack, the one he never went anywhere without. It was lying next to the water, the straps tangled in the long grass. But there was something about it, something wrong. No sign of Jason, no trail leading away, just the backpack, discarded carelessly, as if he'd left it in a hurry. I crouched down, my stomach twisting. The zipper was half open, his jacket hanging out like it had been pulled from inside. The entire pack was untouched, the way he'd left it before he took off on whatever little adventure he decided on. But he didn't take off. I knew it now. He hadn't just wandered away. Something had happened. The woods weren't the same. The air felt thick, like the trees themselves were watching, waiting. I picked up the backpack and held it in my hands, staring at it. A chill ran down my spine as the weight of the silence sank in. Where was Jason? I called his name again, this time the tremor in my voice impossible to hide. Jason, where are you? But all I got was the sound of the stream, louder now, as if mocking me. I felt something shift in the air, like the forest had gone still. The trees stood like sentinels around me, their dark shapes looming in the moonlight. And then, just then, I heard it, a sound, faint at first, coming from deeper in the woods. A rustle, then a crack of a branch, followed by the unmistakable crunch of something heavy moving through the underbrush. I froze, my breath catching in my chest. That wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It was something else. I dropped the backpack and sprinted toward the noise, my feet pounding against the forest floor, each step echoing in the silence. My flashlight flickered, casting brief, disorienting shadows on the trees. I stumbled over roots, branches snapping against my face as I pushed forward. My heart was pounding now, faster than I'd ever felt it beat. Fear had sunk its claws into my chest, and I couldn't shake it. The sound stopped, dead silent. I stopped too, panting, my body shaking from the effort. My flashlight swept over the area, its beam dancing over the twisted trunks of trees. Nothing. The woods had returned to their unnatural quiet. And then, as I turned to go back to camp, I saw it, just for a split second, a shadow moving between the trees. It was too fast to be human, too fluid. It darted behind a large oak, its shape almost like a ripple in the air, then disappeared. I froze, and there, in the silence that followed, I heard a whisper, barely audible. "Help me." It was Jason's voice, but it wasn't. It was twisted, echoed, like it came from somewhere deep within the woods, somewhere I couldn't reach. I didn't know what to do. The woods weren't silent anymore. They were alive, watching, waiting, and whatever had taken Jason was still out there, somewhere hidden in the dark. I turned back toward camp, knowing, deep down, that I was alone now. The woods had claimed him, and I was next. Story 3. I had always thought of myself as the rational one in our group, The one who laughed off ghost stories. The one who didn't get spooked by the rustling in the trees or the way the wind howled like something straight out of a horror movie. That was all nonsense, right? Nothing out there could hurt us. Or so I thought. It was supposed to be a simple camping trip. Just me, my two best friends, and a couple of beers around the fire, telling stories until we couldn't keep our eyes open anymore. The sky above us was thick with stars, the kind of view you couldn't get in the city. There was nothing but the crackling of the fire and the distant sound of the night critters. Peaceful, comfortable, but then something happened. I first noticed it when the flame flickered. Just for a moment, the fire seemed to sputter, like it was fighting for air before it steadied again. It caught my attention enough that I glanced up, and that's when I saw it, a shadow just outside the circle of light. I thought maybe it was one of my friends, Mike or Greg, messing with me. Maybe they were sneaking off to the woods for a quick smoke or to do something silly. Mike? Greg? I called, but the shadows didn't respond. They just lingered, still, at the edge of the firelight. I told myself it was nothing, just my eyes playing tricks on me, and I laughed it off, hoping they wouldn't hear the slight tremor in my voice. But as I glanced back, I saw another shadow, a little closer this time, and it was moving, slowly, deliberately, as though it wasn't afraid to come closer. That was when the hairs on my neck stood straight up. Okay, guys, this isn't funny anymore, I said, my voice a little more shaky now. But still, neither Mike nor Greg answered. The shadows didn't care. They just kept moving closer and closer like they had all the time in the world. I stood up, my legs feeling like lead, and immediately the shadows shifted. They weren't just on the outskirts anymore. No, they were circling the fire. They moved in perfect, deliberate arcs like they were planning something. Each time I took a step, they matched me. If I shifted to the left, they followed. If I went to the right, they did too. It felt like they were closing in, tightening the circle, just waiting for the moment when the fire would go out. I could feel my heart hammering in my chest. I tried to call out again, but my voice got stuck in my throat. This wasn't normal. This wasn't some prank. Something else was here, something dark, something ancient, and it wasn't happy I was in its space. By now, the fire had started to die down, the orange glow growing dimmer, and I realized in that moment how truly alone I was. I turned around to check the tent, hoping that maybe my friends had decided to sleep early, but when I looked back at the fire, they were gone. There was no sign of them, not a trace. No footsteps leading off into the woods. No discarded beer cans. Nothing. Just the shadows, creeping closer with every second. I bolted. Without thinking, I ran straight into the woods, away from the fire, away from whatever it was that circled it. My breath came in ragged gasps, my feet stumbling over rocks and twigs as I tried to outrun whatever was chasing me. The shadows, though, they kept up, always just behind me, never losing their pace. Eventually, I collapsed. My legs refused to carry me any farther. The only thing I could do was wait for the inevitable. And yet, when I finally caught my breath, the shadows had stopped. The silence was deafening. The only sound now the rhythmic beat of my own heart. Dawn came, pale and quiet, with the first light breaking through the trees. My body was sore from running, my head dizzy with the remnants of fear, but when I finally stood and turned back to the campsite, I saw it. The fire was completely out, smothered as if it had never been there at all. The ashes lay cold and lifeless on the ground, and there was no sign of anyone. No footprints, no gear, no friends. Just the empty, oppressive silence of the woods. I don't know what happened that night. Mike and Greg were never found. The police said it was probably animals, maybe a bear, but I know better now. I've been camping 100 times since, but I never sit by the fire after dark, and I never, ever forget the way the shadows moved that night. Slow, steady, and never in a hurry. Story 4. We thought we'd found the perfect camping spot. Just the three of us, me, Jake, and Carla, out in the wild, miles from any road, surrounded by the whisper of the trees and the hum of the wind. It was supposed to be an escape, a weekend of peace, away from everything. No one to bother us, just nature. But nature, it turns out, had other plans. We'd hike for hours through thick brush and dense forest until the air began to smell rich and earthy. The kind of quiet that settles in deep when the world feels miles away. It was getting late when we finally found it. A clearing just big enough for our tents. And that's when we saw it. A cabin. It wasn't a cabin like we expected. No charming little shack with a wooden porch and some old rustic charm. No, this one was wrong. Standing on the edge of the clearing, barely visible through the trees. It looked like it had been there for decades, maybe even longer. Its roof sagged, and the paint had long since peeled off. The windows were dark, the glass cracked in places, and the door hung ajar, creaking faintly in the wind. I remember staring at it for a second, feeling a strange mix of curiosity and unease. But Jake was already moving toward it. Hey, there's got to be something inside. Let's check it out, he said, his voice carrying a little too much excitement. I glanced at Carla, who didn't seem thrilled but shrugged. I guess it couldn't hurt. It's not like we're going to be able to make it back in the dark anyway. So, like idiots, we wandered toward the cabin, each step crunching the dry leaves underfoot. It didn't look like anyone had lived there for years, but as we crossed the threshold of the cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The door groaned as I pushed it open further, the smell of old tobacco and with smoke hitting me all at once. Inside, the air was heavy, thick with dust and the faint scent of decay. The room was sparsely furnished, a couple of chairs, a couch covered in moth-eaten fabric, a fireplace that hadn't been used in who knows how long. Nothing else but silence. Heavy, oppressive silence. I'm gonna look upstairs. Jake called out from the back of the cabin, his voice almost too eager. I could hear his footsteps creak on the old floorboards as he disappeared up the rickety staircase. Carla and I exchanged a look, both of us clearly uncomfortable now. The place was too quiet, too still. We weren't alone, though. I could feel it. Something was here. Let's go back, I muttered, but Carla was already walking toward the fireplace, touching the stones with her fingertips. Just checking it out, she said softly, but I could hear the wariness in her voice too. She felt it too. I turned to the door, ready to leave this weird little place behind, but just as I took a step, I heard it. A faint sound, barely audible, like a whisper behind me. My blood went cold. I stopped dead in my tracks, heart pounding in my chest. "Did you hear that?" I whispered to Carla, but she was still staring at the fireplace, not looking at me. That's when I realized it again. It wasn't just the silence. It was the way the silence felt, like it was watching, waiting, like it was holding its breath. "Let's just go," I said, my voice cracking just a little. But the moment I turned to leave, it happened. The door slammed shut with a deafening crash. I spun around, my heart in my throat. The air was thick with the stench of mildew, and something else, something wrong. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, my skin prickling with the sensation that something was behind me. I could feel it. Someone was in the room with me now. I turned, slowly, my eyes scanning every shadow in the cabin. And then I heard it, the softest whisper, as though someone had leaned in right next to my ear, breath warm on my skin. It was low, almost gentle, but the words they carried sliced through me like ice. "Leave while you still can." I froze, my heart slamming in my chest, throat tight with terror. Carla turned to look at me, her face pale as she stood in front of the fireplace. Her eyes were wide, the same fear settling into her bones. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Before I could answer, we both heard it. Footsteps upstairs. Slow, deliberate. A dragging sound like someone stumbling across the floor. But Jake hadn't come down yet. And then, a shadow shifted in the corner of the room. I don't remember how we got out. I just know we ran, past the door that had slammed shut behind us, past the trees that seemed to close in around us like jaws. I don't even remember how long we ran, but we didn't stop until we were back at the car, breathless, wide-eyed. Jake never came back. The cabin's still there, at least the last time I checked. I don't know if it's still standing, but I sure as hell don't plan to find out. Something's in that place. Something that's been waiting for years. And the next person to open that door might not be so lucky. I don't know if it was the wind or something else, but I'll never forget that voice. "Leave while you still can." Story 5. It was supposed to be just another weekend getaway. Me and a couple of friends, far away from the noise of the city. We picked a spot by the lake, a quiet place we'd all been to before. We set up our tents, built a fire, and cracked open a few beers as the sun dipped below the horizon. Nothing unusual, just a bunch of guys trying to forget about work for a while. But as night settled in, things started to feel off. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a silvery light over everything. The campfire crackled, sending sparks into the night air. That was when I saw her. At first, I thought she was just another camper, someone who had gotten lost in the woods. But as I watched her, sitting there at the edge of our campfire's glow, I realized something wasn't right. She was too still, too quiet, almost as if she was waiting for something or someone. She sat just beyond the light, barely visible in the shadows, her face turned toward the fire. Her hair was long, dark, and tangled, like she'd been out here for days. The way she was sitting, cross-legged, almost perfectly motionless, gave me a chill. It wasn't like any person I had ever seen. "Hey," I called out, raising my voice a little, trying to get her attention. "You lost?" No response. The only sound was the crackling of the fire and the soft rustle of the wind in the trees. I stood up, the beer can in my hand now feeling like a weight I couldn't shake. There was something wrong about her, something otherworldly. My friends were too caught up in their own conversation to notice, so I decided to go check on her myself. Maybe she needed help. Maybe she was just some lost hiker trying to find her way back. I took a few slow steps toward her, my boots crunching against the dry leaves. The air felt heavy, like it was pressing down on me. The closer I got, the more I felt the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. Something wasn't right. My gut was telling me to turn around, but I couldn't. I was almost there when she moved, or at least I thought she did. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart hammering in my chest. She had turned her head just slightly, enough for me to see her face. Her eyes weren't right. They were wide, unblinking, like black pools of nothingness. Not the kind of eyes you'd expect from a person. No pupils, no whites, just an endless darkness. A deep, dark void that seemed to pull me in. I froze, my hand reaching out instinctively, as if I could touch her and make sense of this strange moment. But before I could, she turned her head fully toward me. Her mouth stretched into a grin, one that didn't belong to a human being. It was too wide, too sharp, like something that had been carved into her face. "Don't," she whispered, her voice barely audible, like it was carried on the wind. "Don't come any closer." I didn't think. I didn't wait to hear another word. I turned and bolted back to the fire, my feet stumbling over the ground as panic took over. I heard the sound of her laughter, soft, like the rustling of dry leaves, carrying on the wind behind me. I didn't dare look back. When I got to the fire, I looked around, breathless, my heart pounding in my chest. My friends hadn't noticed anything. They were still talking, laughing, completely unaware of what had just happened. I glanced back at the spot where she had been sitting. The place was empty. The shadows were thick, the only light coming from the flickering flames. But then, just before I looked away, I saw her again. She was sitting there, right where she had been, staring into the fire. Still, unmoving. I don't know how long I stood there, locked in place, staring at her. The fire burned brightly, casting long shadows over the ground. But she didn't budge. She didn't blink. She didn't even seem to breathe. And then, slowly, she turned her face toward me again, her eyes locked on mine. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. The air around me felt thick, like I was suffocating in it. The worst part, she smiled. That same wide, hollow smile. I ran in, without thinking, without even saying a word to my friends. I grabbed my stuff and left. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back to the safety of the road. I don't know who or what she was, but I do know one thing. Whatever it wasn't human. And if you ever find yourself camping in the woods under a full moon, make sure you never take your eyes off the shadows, because sometimes they watch you back. Story 6. I've been camping all my life. Since I was old enough to walk, my dad had me out in the woods, and I loved it. The peace, the quiet, the feeling of being alone in nature. It was always a release from the noise of the world. But this trip was different. I should have known the moment we set up camp that something wasn't right. It started small, the kind of thing you dismiss at first. You know, like when you're walking through a forest and the wind makes the trees creak, or a squirrel scurries through the leaves. But this wasn't like that. It was too rhythmic. I'd been sitting around the campfire, staring into the flames, listening to the crackling of the wood, when I first heard it. Soft, steady, thump, 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 thump. It was so faint at first, I thought maybe it was just my imagination. Or a deer, maybe. There are plenty around here. But then the steps kept coming, and they were too deliberate for an animal. I stood up, scanning the darkness. The fire flickered and cast long shadows, but there was nothing but the woods stretching out before me. Must be nothing, I muttered to myself, but even then, I wasn't so sure. The footsteps came again, closer now. I could feel my heart pick up pace. I grabbed the flashlight and swept it around the clearing. But the beam of light revealed nothing but trees and the stillness of night. I was alone. I thought maybe it was one of my friends playing a prank, but when I called out, no one responded. I walked to the edge of the camp, shining the flashlight in every direction, but there was nothing, not even a rustle in the underbrush. I turned around and tried to shake it off, thinking I was just tired, but then the footsteps followed me. Thump, 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 just behind me. I spun around, the light cutting through the dark, but again, nothing. I could feel my pulse in my throat. There was no breeze to move the trees, no movement around me except for those footsteps. I had to pee. Stupid, I know, but I had to go. So, I made my way to the outhouse a little ways from the camp. I kept my ears sharp, listening to the quiet, hoping to calm my nerves. But then the sound followed me, thump, thump. I stopped. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't imagining it. Someone or something was walking just behind me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and my breath came in short, quick bursts. I didn't even use the bathroom. I just ran back to the camp. The others had already gone to bed. I crawled into my tent, zipped it up tightly, and lay still, my heart hammering in my chest. The footsteps were outside again, circling the camp now, like they were waiting for something. Waiting for me to do something, maybe. I didn't dare move. I barely breathed, but it was no use. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd hear them. Thump, thump. Always a step behind. Always just out of reach. I couldn't escape it. Morning came, and I couldn't believe it. The footsteps had stopped. I opened the tent flap cautiously, half expecting to find someone standing there, watching me. But the camp was still. The forest was still. The sun was just starting to break over the horizon, the light spilling into the clearing, chasing the dark away. I convinced myself it was just my nerves. Maybe I'd gotten spooked by the isolation, by the quiet. Maybe it was just the forest playing tricks on me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, like I wasn't supposed to be there, that something out there had been aware of me. And when I looked back, after packing up and leaving, I knew one thing for sure. The footsteps hadn't gone. They were still there, in my mind, following me, echoing with every step I took away from the camp. I could still hear them, faintly but clearly, and I knew, deep down, that they weren't just in my head. They would follow me, always. Maybe that's the worst part of it. The sound, the feeling of being hunted, of never being able to escape the footsteps that follow. You can leave the woods behind, but you can never leave them. And trust me when I say, you can never unhear them. Story 7. I don't know what made us choose that spot. Maybe it was the quiet, the way the trees whispered as the wind brushed through them. Maybe it was the distant sound of running water, or the way the place seemed so untouched, so isolated. But looking back now, I wonder if something was already watching us, waiting for us to step foot in that cursed patch of wilderness. We were just three old friends out on a weekend camping trip. It was supposed to be simple. Set up camp, build a fire, tell a few ghost stories, and enjoy the silence. We'd done it 100 times before, but this time something was different. The air felt heavy, and the trees, they felt too close, like they were leaning in, pressing us down into the earth. I remember setting up the tent and laughing about how none of us could ever remember the last time we went camping. Things were fine at first. We had a fire going, the usual round of beers, and the distant hum of nature filling the night. But after a while, when the fire began to die down and the shadows stretched long, that's when I saw them. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. The firelight flickered, and I swore I saw something out there in the dark. Just two glowing dots floating among the trees. I turned to the others, ready to laugh it off as a reflection or some animal's eyes. But none of us were laughing. "Did you see that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Mark squinted into the black. "Yeah, I saw it. I thought it was just, some animal, but it wasn't an animal. I could feel it. The way the eyes glowed, they didn't belong. They weren't the kind of eyes you'd see from a deer or a bear. These eyes were wrong, too still, too focused. They didn't blink. They didn't move. They just stared. Time crawled by as we sat there, huddled around the fading fire, every one of us pretending to ignore them. But we couldn't. I swear, those eyes were moving closer. Every rustle in the trees made my stomach tighten. It was like they were circling us slowly, patiently, waiting for the right moment to do something. "What the hell is that?" Jason finally broke the silence, his voice trembling. He stood up suddenly, his eyes never leaving the glowing dots. "I don't know," I muttered, my throat dry. "But whatever it is, it's been out there all night. I think it's watching us." The fire popped, sending a flare of light into the darkness, and for a split second, the eyes seemed to shift, just slightly, closer to the edge of the circle of light we'd made. It was as if whatever was out there knew how close it could get without crossing that invisible line. And then, just as quickly, it pulled back into the black again. I remember looking at Mark and Jason, both of them as pale as I felt. We didn't speak. We couldn't. The night was thick with that strange, suffocating silence that only comes when something's wrong. It was like the woods themselves were holding their breath. We kept our voices low, our eyes darting around, hoping for any kind of sign that we were just imagining it. But those eyes, those damn eyes, didn't blink, didn't look away. "Maybe we should go inside the tent," Mark said, his voice shaking. Jason nodded, but we didn't move. None of us could. We were too scared to take our eyes off that spot in the dark, scared to turn our backs and find something right behind us. The night passed, but it felt like it would never end. By the time the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, the eyes were gone. The trees that had seemed so alive with quiet movement now stood still, like they were holding their breath too. I don't know what happened or why, but they were gone. The forest around us was empty, silent, like nothing had ever been there. But as I packed up my things, I couldn't shake the feeling that those eyes were still watching us, even though we couldn't see them. I felt it deep in my chest, a quiet pressure, like something was lurking just beyond the reach of the daylight. I don't know if it followed us, or if it's still there, waiting for the right moment to return. All I know is I've never gone back to that place, and I don't think I ever will. I'm telling you this now because even after all this time, I still feel them. Those eyes, somewhere out there, I know they're watching. They never blink, and they never forget. Story 8. We'd been on the road for hours, and the last stretch of the journey seemed endless. The trees outside the car window blurred into a solid wall of darkness as we drove deeper into the woods. Mark was at the wheel, tapping his fingers on the steering wheel, humming along to some song I didn't recognize. I was tired, half-dazed, the kind of exhaustion that sinks deep into your bones and leaves you feeling like you could sleep for a week. "I think this is it," Mark said, turning the wheel sharply. The headlights flashed on a narrow, barely visible dirt path that led into the trees. I sat up, blinking, trying to shake the fog from my mind. "You sure?" I asked. "We've been driving for hours. Shouldn't we have seen some kind of sign?" "We'll be fine," Mark said, grinning. "It's just us and the forest now. Peace and quiet. As if the woods would ever be quiet." The trees grew denser, casting long, creeping shadows that swallowed the car's headlights. Mark turned off the engine, and the sudden silence was deafening. We were alone in the middle of nowhere. No towns, no signs of life, just the smell of damp earth and the rustle of leaves in the cool evening air. I pushed open the car door and stepped out, stretching my stiff limbs. The air was cold, colder than it had been back on the road, and the smell of pine mixed with something else, something almost metallic, like the scent of rain before a storm. Mark pulled out the gear, grumbling about the weight of the bags, and I grabbed the firewood. We set up camp quickly. The tents were pitched, the fire was crackling, and the night stretched on like some kind of endless black void. The only sound was the fire popping and the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. We joked around, talking about old stories from high school, but something gnawed at me, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. It was the silence, the way the woods felt too still, like something was holding its breath. That's when I heard it, a low, mournful howl. At first, it was distant, drifting in from somewhere deep in the forest, like a wolf calling to its pack. But there was something off about it, something that made my skin crawl. Mark didn't seem to notice. He was poking at the fire, making stupid jokes like he always did when he was nervous. I tried to brush it off, but then the howl came again, closer this time. It didn't sound like a wolf anymore. It was human. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice shaking despite myself. Mark looked up, squinting into the dark woods. "Hear what?" "That," I said, pointing toward the trees. The howl had cut through the air again, much closer now, closer than it should have been. It wasn't the kind of sound a wolf would make. It was like someone was trapped out there in pain, lost, calling for help, or maybe for something else. Mark shrugged. It's nothing. Just the wind, man. You're hearing things. But even as he said it, I saw the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes darted toward the forest. Something in his voice was too casual, too forced. The howl came again, and this time it was loud enough to make the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It was too human, too desperate. I grabbed the flashlight from the ground and clicked it on. My heart pounded in my chest as I swept the beam across the tree line. The light flickered, cutting through the shadows, but there was nothing there. Nothing but the trees. And then I saw it, a figure moving swiftly through the woods. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks, but the figure was too real, too solid. It was tall, unnaturally tall, moving with an eerie grace as it weaved between the trees, like it knew exactly where to step to stay hidden. It wasn't human, not fully. The howl came again, right behind it, but this time it was closer, almost like it was standing just beyond the firelight. The thing in the woods was drawing near, hunting us, and that sound, it was no longer a howl. It was a scream, a terrible, aching scream that tore through the night. I turned to Mark, my heart racing, but he was frozen, his eyes wide with fear. His hand trembled as he reached for the knife at his belt, but even he knew that wouldn't be enough. Whatever was out there, it wasn't something we could fight. We need to leave, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Now. Mark didn't argue. We didn't even pack up our stuff. We just grabbed what we could and bolted. The fire was still burning, but it felt like a beacon in the dark, drawing the thing closer. As we stumbled through the woods, I heard the footsteps behind us, keeping pace, always just a few steps away, always too close. The howl stopped the moment we made it to the car. The woods fell silent again, like the thing that had been stalking us had finally given up. We didn't say a word as Mark started the engine and drove back down the path. The trees seemed to close in around us, their dark branches reaching for the car, but I didn't dare look back. We never went back to that spot, and I still hear the howl sometimes in my dreams. It's still hunting. Story 9. I remember it like it was yesterday. The chill of the forest air, the crackling of the campfire, the dense woods surrounding us like a dark ocean. Me and my friends had planned this trip for weeks. Just a weekend getaway to escape the noise of the city. We picked a remote spot, deep in the woods, far from any roads or campsites. It was supposed to be perfect, quiet, peaceful. That was until she showed up. We'd set up camp just as the sun started to dip behind the trees. It was one of those days when the light lingers longer than it should, casting long shadows over the forest floor. The smell of pine was thick in the air, and the only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the chirping of the evening birds. We were all laughing, cracking jokes, and passing around the bottle of whiskey we'd brought along. A typical camping night. Then, out of nowhere, there she was. I first noticed her standing at the edge of our camp, just outside the light of the fire. At first, I thought she was just another camper, maybe someone lost in the woods. But then I saw the way she moved, or rather, the way she didn't. She wasn't walking. She was shuffling, hunched over, her back bent in a way that made her seem like she was part of the forest itself. Her clothes were ragged, torn at the edges, and she looked like she hadn't seen the sun in years. Her hair was wild, a tangled mess of gray that seemed to match the twisting branches overhead. But what got me, the thing that made my skin crawl, was her eyes. They were sharp, too sharp for someone that old. They gleamed in the dark, focused directly on us. It was like she was studying us, watching our every move. "Leave before nightfall," she rasped, her voice like dry leaves scraping across a stone. I froze. The others didn't hear her at first, too busy with their own chatter, but I did. Her words hung in the air, heavy with something I couldn't place. Fear, maybe, or warning. It didn't make sense. Who is she? What did she mean? Who the hell are you? I asked, trying to sound more confident than I felt. The woman didn't respond. She just stood there, staring at me with those sharp eyes, unmoving. Her gaze was intense, like she could see right through me. It was unnerving. I took a step forward, trying to shake off the feeling creeping up my spine. "I'm serious," I said, laughing nervously. "What do you mean, leave?" "Before nightfall," she repeated, her voice barely a whisper now. "Leave." At this point, my friends started to notice her too. They looked at her, shrugged it off as some crazy old woman wandering the woods. We all had a laugh, even though it felt a little forced. But when we turned back to the fire, I saw her, still standing at the edge of the trees, her silhouette framed by the dimming light. After a few moments, she turned and shuffled off into the woods, disappearing between the trees like a shadow. We all shrugged it off, still laughing, as if to convince ourselves there was nothing to be afraid of. After all, we were tough, weren't we? Nothing could scare us out here. But as the night went on, things started to feel wrong. The temperature dropped. The night air became cold, almost icy. I could see my breath in front of me, despite the warmth of the fire. The trees above us seemed to whisper, their branches swaying even though there wasn't a breeze. It was unsettling. Every now and then, I would catch a glimpse of movement in the shadows, something just out of sight. But when I looked, there was nothing there. We tried to ignore it, but it was hard to shake the feeling that we were being watched. And then it happened. It started softly at first, a rustle in the woods, barely audible over the crackling fire. Then louder, a voice, the same rasping, dry voice from before, but now it was distant, echoing through the trees. "Leave before nightfall." My heart skipped a beat. I looked around at my friends, but no one else seemed to hear it. I couldn't tell if I was imagining it, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. "Did you guys hear that?" I asked, trying to sound casual. They all looked at me like I was crazy. "What?" "It's just the wind," Tom said, tossing another log on the fire. But I wasn't so sure. A few minutes passed. Then again, that same voice. Clear this time. "Leave before nightfall." This time we all heard it. It was like the forest itself was whispering, repeating the same warning over and over. My friends went silent. We all looked at each other, unsure of what to do. The fire seemed smaller now, the shadows larger. I could feel the weight of the woods pressing in on us. I don't know why, but we stayed. I tried to laugh it off, telling myself it was just some old woman who didn't know what she was talking about. But deep down, something told me that wasn't the case. That voice, it was like it was coming from inside the forest itself. Something was out there. Finally, just before midnight, we decided to pack up. We were done. The air felt suffocating, and we all knew something wasn't right. We gathered our things quickly, not looking at the woods, not looking at the dark shadows between the trees. But as we started to leave, something caught my eye. Through the trees, I saw her again, the old woman, standing at the edge of the forest, just like before. But this time, she didn't speak. She just stood there, her eyes locked on us. There was something hollow about her stare, something empty. I didn't say anything. We didn't talk about it. We just ran. By the time we reached the car, the first light of dawn was breaking through the trees. I dared not look back. We didn't speak on the way home, and no one mentioned her again. But I know what I saw, and I know what she said, and to this day, when I'm out in the woods, I still hear it. Her voice, whispering through the trees, warning me. Leave before nightfall. And now I never stay too long in the woods. Not after dark. Story 10. We've been up to the old trail dozens of times before. A place we knew well. Rustling leaves, the sound of distant birds, the cool touch of the mountain breeze. It was our perfect getaway, far enough from the chaos of the city. Just the woods, us, and the fire we'd build for warmth on those chilly nights. Nothing ever felt out of place, until that night. When we pulled into the clearing, the place seemed wrong. I don't know how to explain it. The trees looked taller, the air felt heavier, and the ground? The ground was uneven, too soft, too unsettled. But we shrugged it off. Old habits die hard, and we had this weird comfort in knowing exactly where to pitch the tents and how to stack the logs for the fire. So we set up camp as we always did. It was just me, Sarah, and Tom, 3 friends out for a quiet weekend. The kind of weekend you tell yourself you deserve after weeks of work, stress, and routine. We cracked open beers, talked about old times, and when the fire crackled to life, the night felt familiar again. Safe. But it didn't take long before I started noticing things weren't quite right. At first, it was subtle, little things. A breeze that didn't feel like a breeze. The way the trees seemed to move in the corner of my vision, but when I looked, they were still. A small tremor underfoot when I walked around the camp, but I chalked it up to the rustling leaves, the crackling fire, maybe even the beer. You know how it is. But then came the scratching. I was in my tent trying to get some sleep when I first heard it. A low, rhythmic scraping like nails on wood. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a fox, digging around. But the sound wasn't right. It was too deliberate, too persistent. I shook Sarah awake. Did you hear that? She stirred, groggy, but nodded. Yeah, sounds like something scratching beneath the ground. Her voice wasn't full of concern, but the look on her face said she was uneasy. She had that look in her eyes, the kind that tells you everything's fine until you realize it's not. Maybe it's just the wind, Tom said, his voice muffled from his own tent. He wasn't a fan of creepy stories, and that's exactly what it felt like. A story, one we all knew too well. But then the ground began to shift. It was subtle at first, almost like the earth itself was stretching or groaning. A gentle, undulating movement beneath the dirt. the kind that doesn't make sense unless you're paying close attention. I lay there, frozen, listening as the scratching grew louder, the earth beneath us trembling more violently now. And then I heard something else, a sound that didn't belong. A grunt, deep, wet, like something or someone was trying to break through the earth itself. I couldn't stay still any longer. My heart hammered in my chest as I crawled out of my sleeping bag and unzipped the tent. The cold air hit me like a slap, but it did nothing to distract from the growing dread in the pit of my stomach. "Stay close," I whispered to Sarah, but she was already on her feet, her eyes wide, scanning the dark forest. I grabbed the flashlight, flicked it on, and pointed it at the ground. The beam danced across the dirt, illuminating the soft, uneven patches of earth. And then I saw it. My breath caught in my throat. A hand. It was pale, bloody, dirty, like it had been buried for years. The nails, sharp, cracked, scraped against the dirt as the hand clawed its way upward, slow, deliberate, as if it was trying to pull itself free. The earth around it trembled, and I could feel the heat rise, even in the cold night. I froze. The hand moved again, inching closer, its fingers curling and twisting like a thing that had been trapped too long and now sought to escape. And with it, I heard a voice, a whisper, so soft I wasn't sure if I was hearing it or imagining it. "You shouldn't have stayed." The words were chilling, icy in the night air, and for a split second, I thought I saw something else, a face, pale and twisted, barely emerging from the ground, eyes black as coal, staring right through me. But then it was gone. I didn't wait. I didn't think. I grabbed Sarah by the arm, yanked her to her feet, and bolted. Tom was right behind us, running without asking questions. The sounds of scratching grew louder, desperate, as though the thing beneath the ground was angry we were leaving. But we didn't look back. We just ran. By the time we reached the truck, the moon was hidden behind thick clouds, and the woods seemed to close in on us, whispering in voices we couldn't understand. We didn't stop running until we were miles away, and even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that the thing beneath the ground was still watching us, waiting for us to come back. We never did. The ground, we learned, had always been unstable, prone to small shifts from the natural decay of the earth. But there was something more to it, something dark that lingered beneath, waiting for us to disturb it. We should have known better, but sometimes you don't see the danger until it's already too late.